Jake had always found peace in the soil. While others sought relaxation in movies or vacations, he found it in the rhythmic motion of planting, pruning, and watching life bloom under his care. His backyard wasn't just a patch of green, it was a masterpiece. A symphony of colors, textures, and scents, carefully curated over the years. Roses stretched toward the sky, lavender swayed in the breeze, and a stone pathway wound through raised beds bursting with vibrant vegetables. It was more than a garden. It was his sanctuary. Neighbors often slowed down when passing by, admiring the meticulous work Jake had put in. Some even stopped to compliment him, marveling at how his yard looked like something out of a magazine. The elderly couple next door would often chat with him over the fence, asking for gardening tips. Even kids from the neighborhood enjoyed walking through the stone path, marveling at the butterflies and bees buzzing around. Jake's passion had started small. A few pots of herbs on the porch, a single row of tomatoes in the backyard. But with time, dedication, and patience, his little project had flourished into something far greater. He had carefully selected plants that thrived together, creating a garden that felt both wild and controlled, like nature itself had designed. He followed all the HOA rules, or at least he thought he did. His fence was the approved height. His plants never crossed property lines, and he kept the space meticulously maintained. There was no reason anyone should have a problem with it, but there was one person who didn't share the neighborhood's admiration: Karen. Karen lived 3 houses down, a self-appointed enforcer of the HOA rules. She was the kind of person who measured grass with a ruler and reported mailboxes that weren't regulation height. She had been on the HOA board for years, and though she technically wasn't the president, everyone knew she pulled the strings. At first, Jake hadn't thought much of her. Every neighborhood had a Karen, right? He figured as long as he followed the guidelines, he had nothing to worry about. He barely interacted with her, aside from the occasional wave when she power-walked past his house, her sharp eyes scanning every lawn like a hawk on patrol. But Karen had other plans. It started with a passing comment, her beady eyes scanning his yard before saying, "A little too wild, don't you think?" Jake had laughed it off, thinking nothing of it. But in the back of his mind, something nagged at him. There was something about the way she said it, like a warning wrapped in fake politeness. Then came the first official complaint, a letter from the HOA. It was worded vaguely, something about maintaining uniformity in the neighborhood aesthetic. No direct violations, no specific instructions, just a suggestion that he should consider tidying up his yard. Jake shrugged it off. His garden was tidy, pristine even. If anything, it was one of the best-kept yards in the entire neighborhood. But the letters didn't stop. Over the next few weeks, he received 2 more notices. One claimed his trellis was too tall. Another suggested his flower beds were an unauthorized modification. It was clear someone had made it their mission to nitpick every little detail of his garden, and Jake had a pretty good idea who that person was. Then, one morning, he stepped outside to find Karen standing on the sidewalk, clipboard in hand, watching him like a vulture waiting for its next meal. That's when he knew. This wasn't going to be a simple misunderstanding. It was a battle, and Karen had just fired the first shot. Hey, real quick, if you're enjoying the video so far, make sure to hit that like button, share it with friends, and subscribe for more awesome content. And while you're at it, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. All right, let's keep going. The first letter arrived on a crisp Monday morning, tucked neatly into Jake's mailbox like an ordinary piece of mail. At first glance, it looked like one of the usual community updates, maybe an announcement about an upcoming neighborhood event or a reminder about garbage collection days. But as he unfolded the paper, his stomach tightened. The letterhead bore the unmistakable logo of the HOA. Dear homeowner, it began in a sterile, bureaucratic tone. It has come to our attention that aspects of your front yard may not be in compliance with the aesthetic standards outlined in the HOA agreement. We kindly ask that you take the necessary steps to maintain uniformity within the community. Please ensure that all landscaping adheres to the approved guidelines. Jake frowned. There was no specific mention of a violation, no direct accusation, just vague, flowery language that seemed designed to confuse. At first, he almost laughed. This had to be a mistake. His garden was immaculate, Every plant was meticulously placed, the pathways were clean, and there was no overgrown mess spilling into the sidewalk. If anything, his yard was one of the most well-maintained in the entire neighborhood. But then, his eyes drifted to the bottom of the letter, where a signature stood out in bold ink. Karen Thompson, HOA committee member. His jaw tightened. He should have known. Jake took the letter inside and read it twice, trying to decipher its true meaning. There was no deadline, no fine, just an unspoken demand to fix something that wasn't broken. It felt more like a warning shot than an actual request. Curious, he decided to ask around. That evening, while watering his tomatoes, he casually brought up the letter to his next-door neighbor, Mrs. Jensen. The elderly woman chuckled, shaking her head. "Oh, that Karen's at it again. She pulled the same thing on the Millers last year. Said their flower pots were too colorful for the neighborhood." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Too colorful?" Then, across the street, Mr. Patel overheard and chimed in. "She once made me repaint my shutters because she said the shade of blue I used wasn't earthy enough. It was in the rule book, but you'd think she was running a dictatorship with how strict she is." The pattern was clear. This wasn't about maintaining the neighborhood's aesthetics. It was about control. Still, Jake wasn't one to stir up unnecessary drama. He figured he'd play along, at least for now. He emailed the HOA, politely asking what specific part of his garden was in violation. A day later, the response came back, short and to the point. "Your trellis structure may not meet HOA guidelines. Please remove or modify it to ensure compliance." Jake blinked at the screen. His trellis, the beautifully crafted wooden trellis that he had installed years ago, the one that was neatly covered in climbing roses, adding charm and elegance to the yard, that trellis? Now, it was his turn to laugh. He grabbed a copy of the HOA handbook and flipped through it. Sure enough, there was a rule about freestanding structures needing approval. But here was the catch. His trellis wasn't freestanding. It was attached to his house, which meant it fell under decorative landscaping features, which were not restricted. Karen had either misread the rules, or she was hoping he had. For a moment, Jake considered ignoring the letter altogether. But something told him that wouldn't be the end of it. Karen wasn't the type to back off easily, so he decided to do something even better. He printed out the HOA guideline page, highlighted the relevant section, and sent a polite but firm response. "Thank you for your concern. Upon reviewing the HOA guidelines, my trellis is in full compliance as it is attached to the primary structure. Please let me know if you need any clarification." He hit send and leaned back, feeling oddly satisfied. Karen had taken her first shot. Now, he waited to see what she would do next. Jake had expected Karen to back off after his perfectly worded email. He had pointed out the rule, proven his compliance, and done it all with a level of politeness that left no room for argument. But Karen wasn't the type to admit defeat. 3 days later, another letter arrived. This one was different. The language was sharper, the tone more aggressive. Failure to comply with HOA regulations may result in formal penalties, including fines and possible legal action. Jake exhaled slowly, gripping the paper. Legal action? Over a trellis? He skimmed the letter again, looking for specifics, but it was the same vague nonsense. No mention of actual violations, no direct demands, just an implied threat wrapped in bureaucratic jargon. This time, Jake didn't bother emailing. He went straight to the source. Karen was in her front yard when he arrived, standing near her perfectly trimmed bushes, clipboard in hand. She glanced up as Jake approached, her lips pressing into a thin smile. "Ah, Jake, I assume you got my letter." "I did," he said evenly, "and I'd like some clarification." She sighed, flipping through her clipboard as if she had more important things to do. "Your trellis is still a concern, and there's also the matter of your flower beds." Jake's brow furrowed. "Flower beds?" She nodded, tapping the clipboard. "They extend beyond the approved landscaping zone, just by a few inches, but rules are rules." Jake clenched his jaw. He had measured everything carefully when he built them. His flower beds were well within the boundaries. Karen, my trellis, follows HOA regulations. My flower beds are within the property line. You and I both know this. Karen's smile didn't waver. I'm just enforcing the rules. If you'd prefer, I can escalate this to the HOA board. Ah, there it was. This wasn't about compliance. This was personal. Jake had seen the way Karen operated. She didn't go after everyone, only those who didn't fall in line. She had tried to intimidate him with vague letters, and when that failed, she moved the goalpost. He took a slow breath. "All right," he said. "Let's take this to the board." Karen's smile faltered for half a second, just half a second. But Jake caught it. A week passed. No official hearing was scheduled. No board members contacted him. But the letters kept coming. Each one was worse than the last. The next letter accused him of repeated violations and included a fine of $200. The one after that threatened an additional fine if the issues weren't resolved within 10 days. The last one warned that continued non-compliance could lead to a lien on his property. Jake had dealt with stubborn people before, but this was something else. Karen wasn't just enforcing rules, she was testing him, waiting to see if he'd cave. By the time the third fine arrived, Jake had had enough. He started digging. At first, he focused on the HOA rules, scanning through the bylaws for any contradictions he could use to his advantage. But soon he found himself researching Karen herself. And that's when things got interesting. Karen wasn't just a committee member, she was one of the founding members of the HOA. She had been on the board for 15 years, long enough to establish an iron grip on how things were run. And in all that time, very few violations had actually been challenged. Most people just paid the fines and moved on. Jake kept digging. He pulled up HOA financial records, looking for patterns, and then he found something that made his heart race: a name. Karen's husband owned a contracting company that just so happened to handle a majority of the HOA's approved landscaping projects. Jake sat back in his chair, a slow grin spreading across his face. She wasn't just harassing homeowners for fun, she was making money off of it. Every time she forced someone to modify their property, they had to hire an approved contractor to do the work. And guess who was at the top of the list? Jake suddenly understood why Karen had been so relentless. He wasn't just defying her authority, he was hurting her business. And now, he had the perfect ammunition to fight back. Jake had spent nights sifting through HOA bylaws, looking for any crack in the foundation Karen had built her power on. Most of the rules were dense, buried in legal jargon that made them deliberately hard to interpret. But the more he read, the more he realized something. The HOA wasn't as airtight as Karen made it seem. Then, just past midnight, he found it. A section buried deep in the HOA handbook, one that probably hadn't been touched in years. Section 14.3, Homeowner-Led Committee Provisions. Jake read the paragraph twice, then a third time. His heart pounded as the implications settled in. If a homeowner gathered enough signatures from residents, they could formally propose the creation of a new HOA subcommittee, one with the power to review existing guidelines and propose amendments. In other words, if Jake played this right, he could change the rules. But there was a catch. To even propose this committee, he needed the support of at least 30% of the neighborhood. Not just casual approval, official signatures from homeowners willing to challenge Karen's authority. That was going to be a problem. The next morning, Jake went door to door, carefully choosing his first allies. He started with Mr. Patel, the man who had been forced to repaint his shutters because Karen didn't like the color. "You're telling me we can actually change the rules?" Mr. Patel asked, rubbing his chin. "If we get enough people on board, yeah," Jake confirmed. "We could create a committee to review unfair enforcement, like, say, excessive fines over flower beds." Mr. Patel didn't need convincing. He grabbed the pen and signed. Mrs. Jensen was next. She had lived in the neighborhood for over 20 years and had watched Karen slowly turn the HOA into her personal kingdom. "You know," she mused as she signed the petition, "it's about time someone put her in her place." Word spread faster than Jake expected. People wanted change. But just when things were looking promising, he hit a roadblock. Jake knocked on the door of the Millers, a younger couple who had received a complaint last year about their overly bright patio lights. He figured they'd be eager to sign. Instead, Mr. Miller sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Look, I think what you're doing is great," he admitted. "But I can't get involved." "Why not?" Jake asked. Mr. Miller hesitated. Then, lowering his voice, he said, "Karen's got ties to the HOA board. If this doesn't work, she's going to make your life hell. She can raise fines, deny permits, even put a lien on your property. Some of us just don't want the fight." Jake clenched his jaw. That was exactly what Karen was counting on. Fear. And she wasn't done yet. The retaliation started small. Jake received another letter from the HOA, this time claiming his hedges were not in compliance. 2 days later, a second notice arrived, warning of an unauthorized modification to his mailbox. The same mailbox that had been standing for 5 years without issue. Karen was sending a message. "Back down, or this will get worse." Jake didn't back down. Instead, he doubled his efforts. He met with neighbors in secret, explaining that if Karen could be voted into power, she could be voted out. That was the key. The HOA wasn't a dictatorship. It only felt like one because no one had challenged it. By the end of the week, Jake had gathered signatures from 32% of the neighborhood, enough to force the proposal. But just as he was preparing to submit it, something unexpected happened. A new letter arrived, not from Karen, from the HOA president. It was an invitation to a mandatory hearing regarding Jake's ongoing violations, and at the bottom, in cold printed letters, was a single sentence that made his stomach drop. "Failure to comply may result in property foreclosure proceedings." Jake stared at the paper, feeling the weight of the threat settle in. This wasn't just about fines anymore. Karen had just raised the stakes. She wasn't playing games anymore. And now, neither was Jake. Jake sat at his kitchen table, the HOA letter spread out in front of him. Property foreclosure proceedings. It was a bluff. It had to be. The HOA didn't have the power to take his home over a few supposed violations. But that didn't mean Karen wouldn't try to make his life miserable in the process. He needed to be careful. He needed to be smart. But before he could take his next step, Karen made hers. And this time, she went too far. It started with a single phone call. Jake was at work when he got the notification. A missed call from an unknown number. Then another, and another. By the time he checked his voicemail, there were 3 messages, all from the same woman. "Mr. Collins, this is Officer Daniels with the County Sheriff's Department. We received a report regarding illegal modifications to your property. We need to discuss this matter as soon as possible." Jake's stomach dropped. Illegal modifications? What was Karen up to now? When he called back, the officer was polite but firm. "A complaint was filed stating that you've built unapproved structures that violate county zoning laws. We'll need to conduct an inspection." Jake ran a hand through his hair. "I haven't built anything illegal," he said. "This is a mistake." "I understand," Officer Daniels replied, "but the complaint was filed with supporting photos. We have to follow up." Jake's pulse pounded. Supporting photos? There was only one person who would go that far: Karen. By the time Jake got home, he wasn't just angry, he was furious. He marched straight to his backyard, scanning every inch of his garden. Everything was exactly as he had left it. But then he saw it. His trellis. The same trellis Karen had been harping on for weeks. Only now it was damaged. Several wooden slats were broken. The climbing roses that had taken years to grow had been ripped down, their delicate stems lying in a heap of wilted leaves. Jake clenched his fists. This wasn't just HOA pettiness anymore. This was malicious. Someone had come onto his property and destroyed part of his garden, and he had a very good idea who it was. Jake wasted no time. He went inside, pulled up his home security app, and scrubbed through the footage from the last 24 hours. And there she was. Karen. At 2:47 a.m., she had crept onto his property, flashlight in hand. She had yanked down the vines, kicked at the wooden frame, and even snapped a few stems with her bare hands. Jake's jaw tightened as he watched her disappear back into the night. She had finally done it. She had given him exactly what he needed. The next morning, Jake took the footage straight to the sheriff's office. Officer Daniels watched in silence, his expression unreadable as Karen's face flashed across the screen. When the video ended, he leaned back in his chair. "Mr. Collins, would you like to press charges?" Jake didn't hesitate. "Absolutely." The officer nodded, jotting down notes. Given the evidence, we can file a trespassing and property damage report. The HOA will also need to be informed. Jake smirked. Oh, don't worry. I'll take care of that part. By noon, every single HOA board member had a copy of the footage. Jake sent it with a simple email. Attached is footage of Karen Thompson trespassing and vandalizing my property. As an HOA committee member, I assume the board will want to handle this matter appropriately. I look forward to your response. Within 2 hours, his phone rang. It wasn't Karen. It was the HOA president. Jake, we need to talk. Jake leaned back, his fingers drumming on the table. Now things were getting interesting. Jake had spent weeks dealing with Karen's harassment, petty fines, bogus violations, and even outright vandalism. But now he had something she didn't expect. Proof. Proof that she wasn't just a power-hungry HOA enforcer. Proof that she was breaking the very rules she claimed to uphold, and he was about to use it against her. The first step was simple. Go public. Jake compiled everything. The bogus violations, the fines, and most importantly, the security footage of Karen trespassing and destroying his trellis. He put it all in an email and sent it not just to the HOA board, but to every single homeowner in the neighborhood. Subject: HOA corruption, what they don't want you to see. Within an hour, his inbox exploded. People were furious. Neighbors who had once been afraid to speak up now came forward with their own stories. Unfair fines, sudden rule changes, and Karen's habit of selectively enforcing regulations on people she didn't like. Even people who had supported Karen before were starting to see the truth. The HOA board couldn't ignore it. Within a day, they announced an emergency meeting to discuss the matter. Jake wasn't just invited, he was the main event. The meeting hall was packed. More people had shown up than any HOA meeting in years. Jake took his seat near the front, his laptop hooked up to a projector. Karen was already there, sitting stiffly, beside the HOA president. She looked calm, too calm. Jake knew that look. She had a plan, but so did he. The HOA president cleared his throat. We're here to address recent concerns regarding HOA enforcement and alleged misconduct. Mr. Collins, you've brought forth accusations. The floor is yours. Jake stood, clicked the first slide, and let the evidence speak for itself. First, the letters, the ridiculous ever-changing violations, the fines, the threats, then the contractor connection. Karen, would you like to explain why nearly every mandatory landscaping correction in this neighborhood was handled by a company owned by your husband? Jake asked, tilting his head. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Karen's face tightened. This is irrelevant, she snapped. I disagree, Jake said, clicking to the next slide, a detailed financial breakdown. He had spent hours combing through records, tracing transactions, and sure enough, over 80% of HOA-mandated modifications had gone through Karen's husband's business. Illegal. Not necessarily suspicious. Absolutely. The HOA president paled. But Jake wasn't done. He clicked the final slide. The security footage. Gasps filled the room as Karen appeared on the screen, creeping into Jake's yard at 2:47 a.m. They watched as she tore down the vines, kicked at the trellis, and vanished into the night. The silence was deafening. Jake turned to the HOA board. This is your enforcer? He asked, his voice calm. This is the person you've trusted to uphold fairness in our community? Karen opened her mouth, but no words came out. She was finished. The fallout was immediate. Karen was removed from the HOA committee that night. An internal review was launched into the misuse of HOA funds. Homeowners demanded new elections, and Karen? She had bigger problems. Trespassing, vandalism, a pending lawsuit. Jake's legal team, assembled with the help of his newly united neighbors, filed a civil suit against Karen for damages. The case was solid. With the security footage and multiple witnesses willing to testify, she had no defense. Her reign of terror was over, but Jake wasn't just satisfied with Karen's removal. He wanted permanent change. With the neighborhood now firmly on his side, Jake used the HOA's own bylaws against them. Remembering the loophole he had discovered earlier, he gathered the required signatures and forced a vote on a new amendment. The proposal? limit the power of HOA enforcers, and increase homeowner rights. To Jake's surprise, the board didn't even fight it. They had seen the writing on the wall. The vote passed. Not only had Karen lost her seat, but the HOA's ability to abuse power was also permanently crippled. For the first time in years, homeowners had control again. And Jake? His garden remained untouched. In fact, after everything, his neighbors came together to help him rebuild it. Better than ever. Because for the first time in years, the neighborhood belonged to them, not to Karen, not to a corrupt HOA, to the people, and Jake had made sure of it. The air inside the HOA meeting hall was thick with tension. The usual dull murmur of small talk was gone, replaced by an electric anticipation. Everyone in the neighborhood had shown up, more than Jake had ever seen at any meeting before. They weren't just here for an update. They were here for Karen's reckoning. Karen sat at the long HOA table, flanked by the remaining board members. She wore a stiff, forced smile, but Jake could see the cracks beneath it. Her hands were clasped a little too tightly, her posture rigid. She knew. She knew this was the end of the road. The HOA president cleared his throat and tapped the microphone. We're here to discuss the allegations against former committee member Karen Thompson regarding misconduct, financial conflicts of interest, and violations of HOA policy. Chut, word former wasn't lost on anyone. Karen had already been stripped of her position. Now, she was just another homeowner. But Jake wasn't done yet. He was here to bury her reputation for good. Jake stood holding a folder thick with documents. Before we begin, he said, his voice carrying across the silent room, I'd like to clarify exactly what we're dealing with. He set the folder down on the table, flipping it open. Exhibit A, the bogus violations. Over the last year, Karen has issued fines for trellises, mailboxes, even flower beds. But here's the interesting part. None of these were actual violations. He turned to the crowd. Who here has been fined by Karen for something ridiculous? At least a dozen hands shot up. Jake nodded. Exhibit B, the contractor scheme. Let's talk about the money. Jake clicked a button on his laptop, and a spreadsheet appeared on the projector screen. Over 80% of HOA-mandated modifications were funneled to one company, Karen's husband's company. A wave of murmurs rippled through the room. Every time she forced someone to change their property, she was profiting. And she never disclosed this conflict of interest. The HOA president shifted uncomfortably. Jake smiled. Exhibit C, the smoking gun. He clicked again. The security footage played on the screen. Karen creeping into Jake's yard in the dead of night, ripping down his trellis, smashing his flowers. The room fell dead silent. Then, "Oh my God," someone whispered. Karen's face drained of color. She opened her mouth, but before she could say anything, the HOA president slammed his gavel. "That's enough." His voice was sharp, cold. "Karen, you have violated HOA policies, engaged in unethical conduct, and abused your position for personal gain. Effective immediately, you are permanently banned from any future HOA involvement." The audience erupted. Cheers, applause, laughter. For years, Karen had ruled this neighborhood like a tyrant. Now, she was just another homeowner drowning in fines and lawsuits. And the best part? Jake wasn't done yet. A week later, the final blow came. The HOA board, desperate to distance themselves from Karen's mess, decided to review every fine she had ever issued. Refunds were given, rules were rewritten. And Karen? She had a new set of problems. With her financial conflict of interest exposed, her husband's company lost all HOA contracts. The board terminated their agreement immediately. Jake stood on his porch sipping his coffee as an official notice was delivered to Karen's mailbox. A formal demand for property, repairs, and unpaid violations, her own rules used against her. The irony was delicious, and as Karen stormed outside, face red with anger, she met Jake's gaze. He simply smiled, tipped his coffee mug, and went back inside. Victory had never tasted sweeter. Jake had won. Karen was out, her reputation in shambles. The HOA had been forced to rewrite its rules. The ridiculous fines were overturned. The neighborhood had finally taken back its voice. But Jake wasn't done yet. It wasn't enough to just keep his garden. He wanted to make sure that no one, not Karen, not the HOA, not anyone, could ever try to take it away again. So, he set his sights on something bigger. Jake spent weeks researching local ordinances, property rights, and land preservation laws. If there was one thing this battle had taught him, it was that knowledge was power. And then he found the perfect loophole. The city had a program for community heritage spaces. If a piece of land met certain criteria, historical significance, environmental impact, or community benefit, it could be registered as a protected green space, which meant no forced modifications, no HOA interference, permanent protection. All he had to do was prove that his garden qualified, and after everything he had been through, he knew exactly how to do it. He started small. Jake invited his neighbors to visit his garden, turning it into an open community space. Children played among the flowers. Elderly couples sat on benches he had built, sipping tea in the shade of the climbing roses. Local pollinators, bees, butterflies, hummingbirds, flourished among the vibrant blooms. Soon people weren't just visiting, they were contributing. Mrs. Jensen donated a bird bath. Mr. Patel brought heirloom seeds from his grandparents' farm. Someone even built a tiny library stand beside the entrance. Jake's backyard had become more than just a garden. It was now a sanctuary, a place for the community, a place that mattered, and that was all the proof he needed. With signatures from over half the neighborhood, Jake submitted the application. The city's environmental committee reviewed his case. Inspectors came to evaluate the space. Officials took note of the thriving plant life, the biodiversity, the positive impact on the community. And then, approval. Jake's garden was officially designated as a protected green space. It wasn't just his anymore. It belonged to the neighborhood. And best of all, it was completely untouchable. The HOA tried to push back. Karen, still bitter from her downfall, tried to argue that Jake was exploiting a loophole, but the law was clear. Not even the board had the authority to override a city-protected designation. Karen, now just another homeowner, could do nothing but watch. The same garden she had tried to destroy was now forever protected, and there wasn't a single thing she could do about it. A month later, the city hosted an official ceremony to recognize the garden as an official community space. A local news crew even showed up to cover the story. Jake stood near the entrance, shaking hands, accepting congratulations. His neighbors thanked him for standing up to the HOA. And Karen? She lurked at the edge of her property, arms crossed, watching as the very people she had once controlled celebrated the victory without her. For the first time, she was truly powerless. Jake caught her glare, and just for good measure, he planted a brand new trellis, bigger, stronger, covered in the same climbing roses she had ripped down. When Karen turned away, slamming her door, Jake just smiled. His garden was here to stay, not just for him, not just to spite Karen, but for everyone, and that was the sweetest revenge of all. If you enjoyed this video and want to see the next part, let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay updated. See you in the next one. Your support means the world.